The first session of the International Relations Conference 2015 on Link West, India and the Gulf focuses on regional security scenario. The chairperson for this track is Ambassador Ranjit Gupta. Ambassador Ranjit Gupta was former ambassador of India to Yemen, Venezuela, Oman, Thailand and Spain. Sir was also the former member of the National Security Advisory Board. Sir was also the director of the workshop on India-GCC relations at the annual Gulf Research Meeting at Cambridge University in July 2011 and of the workshop on India-Gulf Strategic Partnership in a Pan-Asian Cooperative Paradigm in July 2012. So, may I request you to kindly take over the session.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Esteemed founder of the Symbiosis International University, Dr. Majumdar, Principal Director, Dr. Vidya Yeravdekar, the Vice Chancellor of the Symbiosis International University, the Director of the University School of International Relations, the convener of this conference, Ambassador Sudhir Devre, Excellencies, distinguished guests, fellow participants, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to congratulate the School of International Studies on organizing this timely international conference entitled Link West, India and the Gulf. I thank them for inviting me to participate in this conference and to chair the first session on a particularly important subject, the regional security scenario in West Asia, of which the Gulf region is an integral part, and India's options. In the morning we heard the very highly erudite and thoughtful remarks of the Honorable Vice President Shri Hamid Ansari. He is a distinguished former Foreign Service officer who knows the Gulf region exceedingly well and has served as ambassador both to Iran and Saudi Arabia, amongst many other countries. There could not have been a better start to this conference. Over the last 4 decades, the GCC countries have become India's preeminent oil supplier, leading trade partner, with 8 million Indians living and working there and sending annual remittances of $35 billion plus. Indians have long been the largest expatriate group in each of the 6 GCC countries. Even though West Asia has been in increasing turmoil in the past 4 years, the number of Indians continues to increase steadily. Given that in these countries internal security is a major concern, now even more so, these facts are an enormous vote of confidence in Indians and India. Anti-terrorism cooperation and intelligence sharing has become particularly satisfactory. India's anti-piracy operations are greatly appreciated and enjoy the region's proactive support. Defense cooperation is at a level both sides are comfortable with. There are no politically contentious bilateral issues. Both the GCC countries and Iran have consciously dehyphenated their relationships with India from the Pakistani and Israeli factors. Thus, though largely absent in public perceptions, and frankly, even hardly recognized by successive Indian governments, India's most meaningful and best external relationship is with the GCC countries. Despite India having invested the least effort, energy and time to it, as compared to that devoted to Pakistan or other immediate neighbors, China, the US and Southeast Asia. Amongst all, I will first call upon Dr. Raja Mohan, an eminent author, journalist, professor and scholar, and widely regarded as one of India's foremost strategic thinkers and commentators. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Ranjit Gupta. It's a delight to be here at Symbiosis University for this conference. Having seen this university for the first time, this is quite clear that I think you recaptured the spirit of Pune, one of the ancient centers of learning in this country. So I'm really proud and privileged to be part of this gathering today. What I thought I'll do is really to make my central proposition quite clear up front and to explain it to you in the next 15 minutes or so. My sense is Ambassador Ranjit Gupta talked about being modest and prudent. I mean, I have nothing to quarrel about that. But my sense is, as we look to the region of the Middle East or the Gulf, that India is going to be drawn into the security politics of the Gulf, whether we want or not. That there is an objective pull from the region for India's greater involvement. There is also probably emerging push from within India to play that larger role. Because what we've seen happening in the last few years is the growing interdependence between the subcontinent and the Gulf that is rooted in geography, shaped by the logic of economic globalization that is taking place, and the unfolding shifts in balance of power within the region and at the global level. So this is, I believe, inevitable in terms of India's greater involvement in the region. The question how it will actually unfold and what is the best way to do this, I mean, of course, that's a different debate. But I believe the direction is quite clear. But before I look at some of the challenges that confront us today in thinking about India's future role in the security of the Gulf region, that it's important to look back and say, how did we come here? How did we come to the present situation? At least three clear phases in India's security engagement with the Gulf can be discerned. The first was in the period of the British Raj, when the Raj became the principal security provider in the Gulf. That once the British Raj saw off the European rivals, it established dominance over the Indian Ocean and became the main vehicle for providing security in the Indian Ocean. This does not mean, as often assumed, that the British came and did it. It was the Indian resources, military, economic and political, in combination with the British. So it is always, we tend to think Britain was nothing without India in the Indian Ocean. So we got to see that objective circumstance, and I think that role was an expansive one. But post-colonial India saw the region differently, and we also saw the steady diminution of India's security role in the Gulf, both because of the kind of foreign policy premises that independent India took, and more substantively, I believe, because there was a relative decline in India's weight, both economic and military, in the decades after independence. We actually started off quite well. Nehru sought to develop independent foreign policy in this region that included even military cooperation with Egyptians, for example, in this region. There was a crazy idea to actually develop a jet engine and a jet aircraft with Egypt, and with some assistance from the German engineers, of course. But the fact is, of course, that did not fly. But it demonstrated an interest and a desire to develop an independent foreign policy. But after the 60s, we saw India increasingly paralyzed by a series of developments that took place in the region. And I don't want to go into the details, but the fact is, the net consequence of the period from 47 to 1991 was one of steady diminution of India's role. But post-1991, and certainly from the late 90s, that we saw India expand its security role in the Gulf. Both Ambassador Talmiz Ahmad and National Security Advisor Menon both played a key role in constructing a whole range of security relationships in the region. Some of it today the Vice President mentioned in the morning. But what we saw then in the last decade and a half is a steady expansion of India's security engagement with especially with the Gulf region. So where do we go from here, and what would it take to make India a credible, substantive security actor in the Gulf? My sense is we'll have to at least deal with 6 major set of conceptual issues that we need to overcome before we can play that role. So let me list out those 6 broad issues. One is, how do we think about the region? What is our geographic conception of the region? It's quite fashionable. I mean, of course, we always, official establishment, at least in Delhi, calls it the West Asia. Now, this is, I think, is utterly narcissistic that for India to think just because it's west of us, it becomes West Asia. The region calls itself Middle East. the reason why we seem to call it West Asia, I mean, I think tells you, we always, I think, certainly if you look at the Ministry of External Affairs annual reports, well into the mid-50s, it was called the Middle East. But at some point we begin to call it West Asia, as if we are the center and these are merely the rest of Asia was an extension. Maybe some of it is true, but the fact is, the region calls itself Middle East. I think we've got to see the region for what it is, what it calls itself, which also I think involves a deeper problem that we've tended to view the region through our own political preconceptions and unwilling to see the region on its own terms. And I think unless we begin to see the region on its own terms and not what we want it to be or what it ought to be or what it is, that I think the principal problem of conception that remains. And I think here we got to, the emphasis I believe is going to be more and more on the Gulf, because Gulf is going to matter to us a lot more than the rest of the Middle East. So therefore, what happens in the Arabian Peninsula, in Iran, and around that region is going to be of great consequence and great importance. But I think we need to think about this region on its own terms. The second set of factors, I think, which complicates our approach to the Middle East is our domestic politics. There are many parts of our foreign policy which are deeply affected by our domestic politics, including how you think about Sri Lanka, what you do with Bangladesh, what you do with Pakistan. A whole lot of them get deeply influenced by your domestic politics. But it's not often understood why Middle East is a very important domestic political issue. And this is not something new. In fact, the British India had to constantly deal with the fact that most of the European rivals of the Raj tried to foment domestic trouble, especially within the Muslim communities of India, to revolt against the Raj, and fending that off, whether it was by Napoleon, whether it was by Kaiser, whether it was by Lenin. All of them thought the destabilizing the Raj, destabilizing Britain's control of the subcontinent was by fomenting trouble with the Indian Muslim communities. And the Congress party, in fact, if you look at the Indian National Congress, had its own concerns through the national movement, objecting to the kind of things Britain was doing in the Middle East. Use of Indian armed forces, for example, goes back to the 1880s, 1890s. That look, here is a large, that any policy by the Raj must reflect the interests of the people at home, and that you can't do merely things without taking into consideration the sentiments of the people. Therefore, how we dealt with the Middle East, whether it was Khilafat movement by Gandhi, or a whole range of things that happened after the abolition of the Caliphate, that how our domestic politics plays out has been a dominant factor in our approach to the Middle East. And I think this often has had unfortunate consequences, because sections of our own domestic politics have tended to define our interests in the region through the narrow prism of domestic politics. I mean, we're not blaming one section or the other. Many sections in the country tended to use Middle East. In fact, what happens in the Middle East often given less consideration than your domestic political considerations. And I think that has had deep problems, and I think we need to overcome that to be able to explain what's happening in the Middle East to our own people, and to explain to our people what we're trying to do in the region is of our collective interest, and that it is not interest of one particular community or the other. For example, you had the Congress had one particular view. Today, the BJP began by saying, flaunting the Israel relationship. Israel is important, but it's never going to overcome 300 million Arabs or our relationship with Israel or with Turkey. So therefore, finally, you've seen this government make that adjustment to move from merely flaunting the Israel relationship to actually engaging the rest of the region. So the region is vast, and it can't be simplified to having one relationship or the other, and hopefully we will get there. The third, I think, issue that we need to think about this region is to understand the region's internal contradictions. Because for too long, we pretended that this region is a simple monochromatic framework, which is that, look, there is North versus South, there is West versus the Middle East. So it's a fairly simplistic paradigm. We saw this region. It's all about colonialism, and the policy of non-alignment was an extension of anti-imperialism. Therefore, this is all about we all of us getting together in the non-aligned summit and working together to deal with the outside world. But the fact is, some of those ideas came up in this morning, that there are deep internal contradictions within the region whether you call them Arab versus Persian or Shia versus Sunni or intra-Arab tensions. Today the region has serious internal conflicts that are raging and which are of great significance and consequence. So we got to understand this region for its internal conflicts and not merely paper over them by grandiose rhetoric of non-alignment or of one of this is all about Western intervention. So the post-colonial phase in the Middle East had begun quite some time ago, and how those contradictions play out. That I think we got to be more appreciative of these contradictions that are real, that are existing, that are unfolding every day, and I think we need to deal with it. For example, it's often said, we are for non-intervention, those terrible Western powers are for intervention. But today you look at the region, I don't know who is not intervening in the region. So maybe India is not. You see Russian aircraft are flying from Syria, bombing one part of the Middle East. Troops of foreign countries are involved in other countries. There's a war Saudi Arabia is waging at Yemen. So to merely say what is ideal and perfect, that is non-intervention as a principle, and to what is actually unfolding in the region. That is something I think fundamental, and I think it's not saying who's right, who's wrong. That's not our remit to decide who's right, who's wrong. But to understand that there is complicated, divisive politics that is being played out, and appreciating that must be part of any strategy that we devise for the region. A fourth set of issues relates to transcending anti-Americanism. Of course, this is going to be a controversial thing which says that, look, for us who've grown up in the last 30 years, it was fairly simple. Britain replaced America as the dominant imperial power, and therefore whatever goes wrong, it must be America's fault. Quite a bit of us was America's fault in terms of its support for its support for, the conservative forces in Iran or to conservative Islamic forces later. Of course, there's a whole story of it. But what happens if the Americans decide to, as Obama is accused of, leading from behind or step back? If Americans take their hands off, because Americans can live fairly comfortably without either Gulf oil or having to muck around the Gulf for achieving the national security interests. And if the US steps back, and there is US, or if you think US, there is a decline of the American power, how is this going to play out in the region? Because after all, the Anglo-American dominance of the Gulf has lasted 150 years. If the US steps back or does not play the leading role, what happens to the rest? So therefore, for India, for China, for Japan, for Korea, the whole lot of Asians are dependent on it. For the emerging powers within the Gulf itself, that what role we play in the region is going to be far more consequential than it's been before. So in that sense, the agency today of thinking, of acting, of constructing alternative security paradigms rests fundamentally with us. So the lazy phase in which we could merely blame the Americans and say, look, and the Americans and oil was fairly simple, too simple explanatory phenomenon for the region, but the region is being transformed, and I think dealing with that is going to be a problem for us. Then the fifth factor, of course, is the Pakistan factor. Now, United India, undivided subcontinent, as we know, has a decisive, dominant influence over the Gulf. The partition of the subcontinent, of course, created a whole range of problems for us of how we think and deal with the region. Because fending off Pakistan's claim as representing the Muslims of the subcontinent, or of mobilizing the Gulf partners in its conflicts with India, remained a principal problem that Indian diplomacy and strategy had to deal with. But today, I think, but for us to be obsessed about the Pakistan factor, or to make Pakistan factor the decisive element in our engagement with the region, was part of the tragedy. And I think what we've seen in the last 10 years is actually the region is open for relationship with India without a reference to Pakistan factor. And the Pakistan obsession is more in Delhi than in the Gulf. So therefore, I think if we don't shed the Pakistan obsession, that our ability to deal with the region on its own terms and to take full advantage, and you've seen some of that when the Prime Minister was in UAE, when King Abdullah came here, or our engagement with Iran. So therefore, we need to transcend the Pakistan factor. While seeing what's going on, I think we need to develop on the basis of our own shared interests, of what binds us with each of these countries, rather than pose it as a Pakistan problem in the region. And the last of the important factor is the whole question of the rise of China. China has not been a player in the Gulf. Even today, I think the trade is still somewhat lower than our trade. But the fact is, China will be an important player in the region. Because like us, they're deeply dependent on the Gulf for their energy resources. So therefore, how this role will play out, how China-Pakistan relationship will play out, this is going to be an important factor for the future, but I think it is something we need to keep paying attention. So let me come to the final part of it. What is it that we can do? In the morning, Vice President Ansari Sahab talked about supporting the range of local collective security arrangements, developing capabilities, including some autonomous capabilities for interdiction, avoiding entanglement with the Western alliance structures. Some of these ideas have been put on the table. But my sense is, there is a range of things we can do between use of force and doing nothing. Or normally the framing is, look, either you do this or you do that. Send in your troops or do nothing. Or just go to UN resolution and speak about in abstract terms. But I think there are a range of things that can be done in between, and I think some of that were initiated in the last few years on military cooperation, military exchanges, joint exercises, training, counterterrorism cooperation. We've already seen a range of things develop in the last 10 years between India and the different Gulf countries across the divide. And the challenge for us, I think, to elevate this military engagement with the region into a comprehensive policy that seeks to build on these capabilities, and one where India, both in terms of physically supporting different groups, different countries which are looking for security partners, because the region itself is looking for a diversification, because if the Americans are leaving, they are going to look around and see how the security can be reshaped, reorganized. Because unlike in many parts of the world, many of them are small countries. Their fate is going to depend on the cooperation with other countries, with bigger countries. And who do they cooperate with? There is a fresh thinking within the region. So therefore, I think India will have to respond to those demands. And I think the challenge for us is to find ways in which we can improve our security engagement with this region. And finally then, the opportunities, I believe, for security cooperation in the region are unlimited. The problem is largely in the way our mind works, our mindsets in Delhi, and the capacity and the need to develop modern instruments of defense diplomacy or security politics, which will help us respond to the demand for security in a region that is very much part of our extended neighborhood. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Raja Mohan. I shall deliberately refrain from making any comments on any of the presentations, because the comments and questions should come from the audience. Otherwise, the panelists will be engaged in a bilateral dialogue. But you have already seen a little different approach to the region. I now call upon Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, a particularly distinguished Foreign Service officer who has been ambassador in countries very important to India like Israel, China, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, as well as being the Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor.
Thank you, Ranjit, for that introduction, Dr. Majumdar, Dr. Yerwadekar. Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, thank you very much for that. I am going to add to that difference that Ranjit just spoke about, because like Raja, I do believe that we should be doing more in the region. But I have one bone to pick with Raja. He says we should call it the Middle East. Now we have people to our east who call themselves the Middle Kingdom. We have people to our west who call themselves the Middle East. Where does it leave us? I'd much rather stick to West Asia. It's a geographical, neutral term. But I think we're all talking about the same region, and I think we all know what we're talking about. But my question really, to carry on from where Raja left it, is if India is so vitally connected to the Gulf, and you ask any Indian, he'll tell you diaspora, 7 million people, oil, gas, remittances, holy places for a very large number of Indians who profess one of the world's oldest religions, Islam, and so on. If we're so vitally connected, why is our footprint in West Asia and the Gulf, our security footprint especially, so light? And it wasn't always so. Again, as Raja has reminded us, not before independence, not even after independence, in the 50s and in the early 60s, when we worked politically and in terms of security with friends in the region, and friends of all political shades, from Nasser's Egypt to King Ibn Saud to, the Shahanshah of Iran. We worked with them all. To my mind, the answer is at least partly paralysis induced by too much analysis. As our familiarity with the region has grown and our capabilities have increased, we have become more and more aware of the nature of the divisions in the region and the intractable and complex nature of the problems. Now, if you think of it, in 1956, during the Suez Crisis and the war, it was a fairly straightforward case of aggression against a sovereign, developing, fellow non-aligned nation. And you took a stand on it and acted, but your capabilities were very limited, so you did what you could within that. On the other hand, it's much less easy and obvious and simple to take a strong position and to act on chronic regional divides, whether, and Raja mentioned some of them, whether you call them Shia Sunni or Israel-Palestine or Kurds or Yemen or Turkey versus whoever her enemy of the day is, and so on. Or on civil and internal conflicts within states in West Asia, or on jostling among regional powers, whether it's, Egypt, Iran, Saudi, Turkey, and so on. So the benefits of choosing sides, of intervention, of getting involved politically, militarily, in terms of security in these more complex situations are much harder to justify. And then the international context has also got much tougher, whether it is Western regime change agendas, which are being pushed aggressively and militarily, or whether it's the rise of religious extremism and the political uses of religion, such as when you see the role of the Muslim Brotherhood and the rise of ISIS or Daesh or whatever you want to call it, and the fracturing of unity among those who advocate the Palestinian cause. But no matter how complex the situation is and you think it is, and as Ranjit reminded us, the risks of intervention, to my mind, India's interests today have grown to the point where, and we today have capabilities where it is essential that we actually start getting much more involved in the region and strengthen not just our security cooperation, but also what we do with partners in the region. Let's look a little more closely at our interests. Simply put, our interests in West Asia have grown exponentially as India has grown. Over 35 years of 6.5% GDP growth have made us much more dependent on the oil, natural gas that we import on our exports to West Asia and on the security of the sea lanes that pass through and to the Gulf and the Red Sea and the Eastern Mediterranean, and all along the western littoral of the Indian Ocean. We must now therefore list maritime security in the region among our primary concerns. And that's why we chose to deploy naval assets to counter piracy in the Gulf of Aden and off the coast of the Horn of Africa since 2008. And that's why, for the last decade or so, we've been building up maritime security cooperation with countries in the Gulf, with Oman, with Qatar, with others. And space is clearly opening up because our partners in the Gulf, in the region, are actually inviting a greater Indian role in maritime security. And we need to see how the existing templates that we have, for instance, already in the Western Indian Ocean, where we work together with Mauritius, Seychelles, Maldives, Sri Lanka, and the others, how we can extend those. Of course, there's no one size that fits all when we look at these relationships. But the goal should be clear, to use whatever capabilities we have to work with local partners to develop maritime security. Secondly, our internal security is much more linked to West Asia than ever before. And this is not just people using West Asian developments to try and complicate or to push Indian politics in directions which they want. We have seen a rise of religious extremism and of its use for political and other purposes. And that is sought to be used as a force multiplier for cross-border terrorism from Pakistan into India, whether it's Lashkar-e-Toiba or other gangs like that. So we once used to say with great pride that there were no Indians in Al-Qaeda. I mean, many of us used to do this. I can't say that anymore. Today there are Indians fighting with ISIS, in fighting for ISIS. The fight by some of us in India against communalism and polarization within our own society gets harder in such a regional context, where extremist and terrorist groups can get support, funding, and ideological legitimacy from West Asia. And we've already begun to work very closely with states, governments, regimes in West Asia who share intelligence, act together with us against these terrorists. And we do so successfully across a range of cases. And this cooperation needs to be extended, even if some partners still segment between good and bad terrorists and so on. But where we can work together, I don't see why we shouldn't follow our own interests and do so. Thirdly, geopolitics have also made West Asia much more important to our future. If we want to grow at 8 to 9% a year, we need a peaceful extended periphery from Suez all the way to Southeast Asia, from Mozambique to Central Asia. And yet, these are precisely the areas where conflict is now ranging, in the long arc of deepening instability from the Maghreb to Pakistan, spreading to sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, and so on. And whatever the causes, each one of us might have different ideas on what the causes are. And there are multiple candidates for these causes: Western regime change agendas in Iraq, Libya, Egypt, Syria, internal strife in Yemen, Afghanistan, Pakistan, the rise of authoritarian extremist regimes, and so on. We can all list whatever we think. But whatever the cause of this instability doesn't seem like it's going away. It's not vanishing very soon, and the great powers are increasingly involved directly and through proxies in ways that do not promise the early return of stability. We've just seen that in response to first movers from the West, Russia and China are now militarily intervening in Syria to defend their assets, Tartus as a naval base and so on. Fourthly, for us, West Asia represents access to Central Asia and potentially overland to Europe. If we are to ensure that these vital communication links survive and are usable, we must work actively with Iran to actually implement long-discussed but unrealized ideas of a north-south corridor, of the Chabahar port project and its links, the India-Pakistan-Iran oil pipeline, and other connectivity projects. And to the extent that these can be tied into the connectivity that China is building through the One Belt, One Road initiative, we should use Chinese-built and funded infrastructure, piggybacking or leapfrogging on it, to serve our interests in staying connected to the rest of the world. There is another phenomenon which I think causes some confusion in our minds in India. The last few years have seen one secular regime after another brought down, or at least brought down to its knees, by outside intervention in Iraq, in Libya, now in Syria, or by internal developments, as in Turkey. And with our internal security concerns and links to the region, we have an interest in strengthening those secular forces that do survive, using our capabilities towards this end. We do have assets in the region, and our traditional ideological links, which we often tend to forget, witness the Ali brothers and the early Muslim congresses and the whole history of those congresses. And if you think back to that, we actually do have not just an interest, but also long-standing links which we which we can actually use to draw sustenance from today when we act in the region. I don't want to leave you with a completely gloomy picture of all these security threats and how bad it is for us and how terrible the situation is. Let's also count our blessings. Unlike previous rounds of turmoil in the region, this time around we haven't had an oil price shock. Both times before we did, whether it was the 1973 war and what happened and then you got a global recession, or whether it was after the Iranian Revolution, which again led to a spurt in oil prices and then stagflation for a couple of years in the global economy. That we have avoided. But the downside of this, why have we avoided it? Partly, of course, because of supply and demand, also because the West is maybe less dependent on West Asia for oil price stability, for oil and for price stability, actually. But if that is so, the downside is that the West may be more willing to take risks in pursuit of their regime change agendas in Libya and Syria and elsewhere, because they have less of an interest in the stability of the region. Now, certainly, we cannot achieve all these goals that I've outlined, our interests, on our own in a very complex region like West Asia. We need partners from the region, not just one, but several partners. And depending on what we're doing, we do find that we have partners. Iran is central to many of our concerns, whether it's maritime security, whether it's access to Central Asia, to Afghanistan, whether it's peace in Afghanistan. You can list the range of political and security and other geopolitical issues on which we have common interest, stability in the Gulf as well. Saudi Arabia has become a very valued partner in counterterrorism, and that's something that we will continue to grow in the future. Egypt, whatever her regime, has been a factor of stability in the region, which is exactly what we seek. And the Gulf states are naturally interested in a greater Indian contribution, and it's something that I think we need to respond to. So in other words, I am convinced that it is time for a much more active, maybe a forward Indian policy in the region, because it's demanded by our own interests, and because the context and the regional powers seem ready for this. There will always be voices of caution in India who say, no, sit on the fence, don't choose sides, do nothing, don't get involved, you won't get burnt, wait till it settles down. The trouble is it shows no sign of settling down. And when it does settle down, there probably won't be any space left. Fortunately, we have a past we can build on, and we have a good start. Our Prime Minister has recently visited the region, will be going again. Our President is going to Israel, Palestine, Jordan next week. But what is essential is that we change the way we think of our approach to these problems, and that we follow up on the ground on what we do, and get much more intimately involved in the region. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now call upon Dr. Janardhan to make his presentation. He has lived in Dubai for the past 15 years and now works with the UAE Foreign Ministry. He enjoys high standing amongst international scholars of the Gulf and West Asian region.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to thank Dr. Majumdar and members of the faculty here at Symbiosis for this opportunity. I think the beauty of social sciences is that it is very objective. It's very subjective. So we can all differ in our opinions, and we've already seen differences of opinion in the line of speakers that have already spoken, and yet we can at the end say that we all agree to disagree. I'll start with some cartoons for you, which have appeared in some mainstream newspapers in the US. Each one of these cartoons that you will see here encapsulates West Asia's and US's troubles. If anything, things have only gotten worse, with a bigger basketball of trouble called ISIS dwarfing the rest. With each passing year, the US has created, than solved, more problems. Unfortunately, it believes that it has left behind an impression. That's what it says. I like to think we've left an impact on the region, which is a deep crater of mess. In doing so, they are following the tradition of many major powers of the past by going down a hole that we are all very familiar with. Since this conference is about international relations, it's only right that we look at how events in West Asia are linked to foreign policy failures. In my view, while pondering over what drives foreign policy, at least 4 P's come to mind: principle, profit, power projection, and prestige. In trying to achieve these ends, the Chinese and Russian anti-West foreign policies have been more confrontational than constructive. Turkey's zero-problem foreign policy created more problems than solutions. The United States poke your thumb at others' noses while its own is bleeding is a lesson at what foreign policy ought not to be. In following the United States on many issues, many European countries have no independent foreign policy of their own. India's play it safe approach is indeed safe, but non-purposeful from a global perspective. And less said the better about the foreign policies of the West Asian countries, which are either with or against the United States and the rest of the West. It is pertinent to point out that 2014 marked the 25th anniversary of the collapse of the Berlin Wall, an event that led Francis Fukuyama to predict the end of history and the beginning of the universal Western liberal values. The question is, has it? Now, with regard to West Asia and the Gulf developments, it is ironical that the Arab uprising, which began as an attempt to seek political freedom to mend economic depravity, has achieved neither. Instead, flames from the self-immolation in Tunisia have triggered an international power struggle between and among nations and non-state actors, thereby sending the global balance of power into a spin. The only positive, perhaps, from the Tunisian developments has been that Tunisia has settled down a fair bit than the rest, and we now have Nobel Prize winners for peace this year from there. Thus, Arab uprisings have been compared to the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran, the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and the 9/11 attacks in 2001. All these events impacted the political security equations in West Asia and led to geopolitical changes and ideological rivalries to fill the power vacuum in the region. As a result, there are now indications that a transformation of the international order, a unipolar world at present, is either in progress or would follow as a result. Following are some of the important trends in West Asia and Gulf. The Arab uprisings reinforced the regional approach versus the international approach. The region understood that most of the regional crises were triggered by the adoption of Western solutions, including the use of force. This hastened the approach of regional perspectives for resolving regional issues. In the present scenario, contrary to international affairs affecting the region's politics, the events following the Arab uprisings impacted international affairs. One of the most significant fallouts of the uprisings is the reversal of the rapprochement efforts on several fronts. Before the Arab uprisings, there was a GCC-Iran rapprochement effort, Turkey-Iran, GCC-Syria. Even Syria-West rapprochement was reversed after the Arab uprisings. The lack of coordination in the Gulf Cooperation Council countries' foreign policy management was evident during the Arab uprising and continues to do so. After being a neutral mediator, the GCC countries began to take sides, supplied foreign funds and arms to opposing factions, and may even have ventured into direct military action. Together, the GCC is facing one of its toughest challenges since it came into being 34 years ago. The GCC stand on the Syrian crisis in particular became one of the factors that widened the Sunni-Shiite divide in the region, intensifying Saudi-Iranian competition, which made sectarian divisions more pronounced and even led to the rise of ISIS. Non-state actors have become bigger enemies than state actors. Osama bin Laden may be dead, but signs of more radicalized outfits like ISIS are evident across the region. The fact that Iran, GCC countries, and the West are ready to be on the same side is the telling strength of non-state actors. The decline in influence of great powers like the United States and Russia in West Asia is leading to a tentative rapprochement between them. Both work together while dealing with Iran and may work together in Syria too. The West talks with Iran and the fight against ISIS have also improved the possibility of GCC-Iran dialogue at some point in the future. But the overall rise in political tension and the deteriorating security scene has also meant more indulgence in arms race. In the midst of all this, the Palestinian issue has become marginalized even more, so much so that today we are not able to definitively label if the current protests in the Palestinian territories are the third intifada or not. Who are the winners and losers in the region? Some suggest it is a new Arab Cold War. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Jordan, perhaps even Morocco, appear to be forming some kind of a group. At the same time, Qatar, Iran, and Turkey is looking different with a different point of view, perhaps joined by Oman. Oman is desirous of including Iran and Iraq in this group. What could be expected from these alliances? Where do Western states, Russia, and Asian countries fit in? Perhaps a part of this answer can be seen in Russia's intervention in Syria. What about Iran? Some suggest that Iran is the biggest beneficiary of the regional instability. Others, including Iranians, however, suggested, at least till President Rouhani won the election, that the Arab Spring has given rise to an Iranian autumn. Rouhani's win and subsequent talks with the West culminated in the nuclear deal, which means military option is off the radar and Iran's return to international mainstream is imminent, apart from its economy receiving a boost. The Iran issue has ensured division within the GCC fold, especially Oman's role in facilitating Iran-US talks and the recent Qatari offer to mediate between Iran and the GCC if required. This was alluded to by the Vice President this morning. Even though Iran has made the United States look weaker with the nuclear deal, it has in one sense made the US look like a nice guy for a change. The credit for this goes to Barack Obama, who is neither black nor white, but a grey president according to me, and who will be better judged in the years ahead than he is at present. Notwithstanding the Obama factor, how have the West Asia developments and scenario impacted the United States, which has been referred to as a super broke, super frugal superpower? The Arab uprisings have hastened the decline of the US influence in the region that was already witnessing a US fatigue and a regional fatigue of the United States. The fatigue on both sides has been greatly influenced by the Obama administration's efforts to correct the military misadventures of the Bush administration, which affected the US domestic economy, thereby necessitating defense budget cuts and the pivot to Asia. referring to the US military, the pronouncement in May 2014 by Barack Obama that just because we have the best hammer does not mean that every problem is a nail, is an important admission in Obama's continued attempt to refashion American foreign policy. The only reason the GCC countries are still holding on to the United States is due to its security cover in a region that equates national security with regime security. In the event that there is likely to be a credible alternative, even in the distant future, American influence is bound to diminish enormously. Future GCC search for alternatives. Over the last decade, the Gulf security debate has revolved around 2 points of view. 1, less international involvement in the region's efforts. 2, more internationalization of the region. Since the dominant view favors the second option, there have been calls for exploring the idea of incorporating several international actors who could act as security guarantors of any future security arrangement in the region. Some of the GCC leaders have issued statements in support of this argument and idea. I will just read out one such comment. It is clear that the Saudis fully intend to pursue their national security interests much more assertively, even if that leads to a strategic break with the United States. Thus, rather than put all their eggs in one basket, the new concept is omni-balancing, which means that the GCC ties with the United States are no longer exclusive. I want to take you back to the title of my presentation where I say New Gulf. Here's why it's new. Long before we were aware of IBM, the Gulf countries were already famous as IBM countries. Not the computer hardware company that we associate IBM with, but as a negative attribute of an acronym of Arabic words. I for Inshallah, God willing, B for Bukra, and M for Malish. If you went with a proposal to the Gulf, the general response would be IBM. Let's see if we can do it tomorrow, God willing, but the ultimate response would be a no, sorry. But for the last decade and a half, the Gulf is different. It's more like the Maggi noodles, not the perfect example to give you. Things get done in 2 minutes. The GCC countries have been conditioned by a mood referred to by some as spirit of possibility, aided by high oil prices, at least until a year ago, and consequent economic diversification and growth. The second factor was the failure of others in dealing with the regional issues, which reinforced exploring local solutions for local problems. The third factor is what is described as the real strategic shift in the region's foreign policy. Owing to the failure of the United States and the shift in the economic power center from the west to the east, the GCC countries began building ties with a host of alternatives, particularly Asia. It is in this context that some like-minded Asian scholars, including some of us here, have been pushing the idea of upgrading the GCC-Asia buyer-seller relationship to a strategic one at both Track 2 and Track 1.5 levels. We are also exploring possibilities for a new collective security architecture, which would involve both Asian and Western powers, and without excluding the United States. The point is that Asian powers will have to stop riding piggyback on US naval presence in the region's waters at some point and start finding their own means of securing their sea lanes. Assuming that the US engagement in the region would progressively diminish in the years ahead, this opens up interesting possibilities by diversifying the number of security players catering to the region's security and stability. From a wider perspective, the pursuit by various actors of principle, profit, power projection, and prestige via their foreign policy is transforming West Asian politics, which bears the potential to alter the geopolitical situation currently based on a unipolar world. Any alternative multipolar power center that may materialize in future must not be viewed as a competitor with the United States and other Western forces. Rather, it should be approached in the spirit of cooperation in a post-US world which is not necessarily an anti-US world. Finally, I've deliberately left out India in my presentation because we've already had 2 speakers talking about it and we'll have more people talking about it in the future. But I just want to link it up with the new Gulf. I think the new Gulf began pursuing a look east policy over the last decade, perhaps a little more than that. But I think India has been a little late in reacting to the overtures made by some of the Gulf countries, because we have been we've been focusing more towards the West, because I think in terms of a rising power, the acknowledgement from the West as a power, as a power to be is more important for us than from our neighbors. I only urge that in the years ahead, India reciprocates to the overtures made by the Gulf countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a particularly insightful presentation explaining the rationale behind what is happening on the ground in West Asia. May I now call upon Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed, the former ambassador to the UAE, Oman, and twice to Saudi Arabia. It is my considered opinion that few in the country could claim to know more about the region than my friend and colleague Talmiz.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, the West Asian scenario today has the following characteristics. At the heart of the ongoing confrontations is the divide between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It emerges from certain strategic concerns that Saudi Arabia has about its status in the evolving situation, but it has acquired, unfortunately, a deeply sectarian character. The confrontations between these two Islamic giants are today being exhibited in Syria, Yemen, and to a lesser extent in Iraq. But there is another competition that is taking place within the Sunni community itself. There is first the political rivalry between Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood, which is muted at present, but it has the capacity to re-emerge. But more importantly, we have the forces of jihad, which are challenging the supremacy of the Wahhabi order led by Saudi Arabia and the Muslim Brotherhood itself. You then have the emergence of a certain rivalry between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State. It is still at a nascent stage. It has as of now, the Islamic State appears to be the next generation of jihadis and has the potential to take over the leadership of global jihad. We cannot rule out the possibility of the various jihadi groups coalescing under the Caliphate while retaining a certain degree of operational autonomy in their geographical spaces. You also have the domestic factor. Each country in West Asia is grappling with domestic challenges. Certain fault lines have re-emerged and certain old fault lines have been given a contemporary resonance. Following the departure of despotism and autocracy, this is not unnatural. But this has also been aggravated by the role playing of certain external players. For example, in the case of Syria, you have a very robust role of neighboring countries supporting certain militia, and you have other countries supporting the alternative militia ranged against them. And finally, you have the role of the great powers. You have the United States giving the impression of not wanting to be involved militarily in correcting the various deviations taking place in the region, but only intervening if their own interests are directly threatened or if the interests of their allies are directly threatened. That does not seem to be the case. And then you have the re-emergence in the regional firmament of Russia, which has intervened earlier politically and diplomatically and now militarily. and is now a game changer as far as Syria is concerned, with the possibility of regime change now in the remote future. We have a nightmare scenario before us. The horrific, that all these confrontations and divides and military interventions could evolve into a horrific confrontation between the two Islamic giants and bring the entire region in a scenario of fire and destruction. What are the implications of this for us? You have heard already that our energy security interests are directly linked with the stability of this region. We get about 75% of our oil from the Gulf, and there are projections that by 2035 it will be 90%. We cannot support the projections of growth rates of 8 to 10% if we do not have energy security. And these growth rates are crucial, indeed essential, if we have to have a role in regional affairs, and domestically if we have to raise people out of poverty. We also have very solid economic connections with this region. And as the Prime Minister's visit to the UAE has shown, that these are significant potential partners for us in terms of the development of our infrastructure, that they are very robust, that they are likely to be very robust, investment partners in our region. And then of course you have our community, 8 million strong. There is no scenario that we can envisage with all the resources that we can command that we would ever be able to evacuate these people in a scenario of conflict and conflagration. We also have larger interests. About 60%, more than 60% of Gulf oil is now being consumed in Asia. So Asian future is directly linked with the stability in this region. We are also looking at certain physical connectivities. We already have the basis for the new Silk Roads of the 21st century. We have energy connectivities, financial connectivities, technological connectivities, and we have the movement of our people right across this region. But we are also looking at physical connectivities, new connectivities in the shape of the one road, one belt. And we are also looking at our own connectivities. We are looking at pipelines. None of this would be possible if the region did not resolve its serious differences. The Americans do not seem to have any answers, and the answers that the Russians have proposed are very significantly military in character, and they are also one-sided. I therefore propose to you, I therefore put before you a proposal for an initiative by India to shape a collective security arrangement in this region. What I am envisaging is, through diplomatic effort, prepare a platform for dialogue in terms of which the principal players of this region can sit together and enter into discussions. Finally, the various problems have to be resolved by them. We cannot do so from outside. We can only encourage such dialogue. Why do we need to do this? Because the level of mistrust and lack of confidence is extremely deep. We know what the reasons are. From the perspective of Riyadh, the strategic balance has shifted to their disadvantage, first with the fall of Baghdad, where they feel that there is a certain expansion of Iranian influence, and already you have Iranian presence in Syria, Lebanon, and now in Yemen. You have a nightmare scenario, therefore, of this thing which they call the Shia Crescent. This is the source of their insecurity. They also believe now that after the nuclear agreement, the Iranians are going to flex their muscles in the region. They have been quarantined. They have been shut away by the sanctions regime for all these years. Today these chains have been removed and they can once again play their legitimate role in this region. This is a source of concern. Of course, the Saudis have shaped their concerns on the basis of a sectarian threat that they believe is before them. How do you address these concerns? Because there is no other way you can. If they were to continue on the path of confrontation, It can only lead to further conflict and possibly even greater war. What are the models that I have before me? I have two models. There is one model in Europe during the Cold War. It is the Council for Security and Cooperation in Europe. It was set up in 1977 and continued till 1992. It brought in 35 countries of Europe, many of them in deep contention. They set up working groups and they had various ways of engaging with each other so that they would build confidence. They were able to, at that time, they were able to study issues relating to disarmament, of thinning out of forces, of setting up communication lines with each other. The second template that I have is the ASEAN Regional Forum. This is a gathering of the world's countries, of the world's nations that have a direct and abiding interest in the security of Southeast Asia. It is a dialogue platform. It is not for action, but it is for an exchange of views. And there are various patterns of dialogue that take place already. Some of them are of bilateral character. Some of them are where individual countries meet the ASEAN members as a whole. Or you have the entire group meeting with the ASEAN. So there are various ways in which you have engagement. You also have engagements on the sidelines of these various discussions. You also have a Track 2 platform that is available to the ASEAN Regional Forum in the shape of CSCAP, Council for Security Cooperation in the Asia Pacific. Now, what are the challenges? First let me describe the initiative. It has three attributes. Number one, it is diplomatic. It is not envisaged that we will be mobilizing various forces that will come into play. It will be diplomatic. This diplomatic effort will be India-led in the sense that India will then put together a set of countries from Asia that have a direct and abiding interest in the security of this region. I would envisage in this regard a possible role by China, Japan, Republic of Korea. It could be within the framework of BRICS or BRICS Plus or any other arrangement, but it must essentially include India and China as lead role players. I have suggested, so the first will be diplomatic. Second is, I am calling it inclusive, in the sense that nobody is left out. Anyone who feels that they have a stake in Gulf security are welcome to be partners in this discussion. And thirdly, it will be incremental. By this I mean that the existing security arrangements that you have in place at present will continue, because they will then give you confidence. As you develop mutual confidence between the principal role players of the region, these will automatically become redundant. What are the challenges before this? The first challenge is very simple. Asian countries have no record whatsoever of consultations between them to pursue security in a third region. And the attendant and connected drawback in this proposal is that many of the Asian countries I have mentioned have bilateral issues with each other. Some of them appear to be somewhat intractable. Why do I still push this before you? Because I feel that the consequences of further conflict in West Asia are so serious that we have no future. These 4 or 5 countries I have mentioned have absolutely no future. Imagine the situation regarding China. China gets 60% of its oil from this region, and China has great ambitions about its own status. Japan and Korea get all of their oil and gas from this region. So when you are seriously, fundamentally threatened on long-term basis, that forces you to think fresh thoughts and to then consider how you can work together for the common good. You will still have your bilateral differences. I'm not denying that. But you can still put together a discussion platform first amongst yourself and then start engaging with the countries concerned. What are the positives? I have mentioned the challenges. What are the positives? The main thing is that India is fully equipped to lead such a role. It has 5,000 years of continuous interaction with this region. It enjoys very great cultural comfort. They have confidence in India. All the countries concerned have excellent bilateral relations with India. All of them value India's principles, which are non-interventionist and non-prescriptive and non-hegemonic. They admire India's democratic order and its multicultural ethos. Also, we are better placed because the other Asian countries do not have these various attributes. Yes, China has much more military power perhaps. It is also a member of the Security Council, but it has no experience whatsoever of the Gulf. And its academics in their various writings have said so. They say we do not know the culture of this region, we do not know the language, we are not familiar with their politics. Compared to 8 million Indians in the region, they have 150,000. But they also have high stakes. They have half the major projects in this region have been given to Chinese companies, and they are valued at $150 billion. That should focus your mind a lot on the security. So I therefore suggest that initially let us commence with a track 2 or track 1.5 dialogue. Let us get together, Chinese, Indian, Japanese and Korean, sit together and then start thinking what we can do. And then once we have shaped a certain consensus between us, there are various steps that we can take with regard to the actual implementation of this idea, possibly in the shape of special envoys or national security advisors who will then engage with the countries concerned and at some stage bring them together. What you do not have, it is the easiest thing in the world for people to say, "Ye nahi ho sakta, ye nahi hoga sahab." Because then you don't have to do anything, you can go back home and go to sleep. That option is no longer available. India does not have the luxury of being a free rider anymore in this region.
Thank you very much. I believe that this audience is the first public audience in India which has listened to a detailed exposition of what we are 4 or 5, a group of us who have been working on how India can be meaningfully engaged in reshaping the security architecture of the Gulf region. It's an ambitious project, but all ambitious and innovative ideas take time to mature. That is the kind of activism which is positive, non-dangerous, and hopefully will change the situation in the war-infested, conflict-infested West Asia on a permanent basis rather than the kind of tactics and policies adopted by the Western world. One point before I open the floor for questions. Professor Raja Mohan referred to India's Pakistan obsession in the Gulf region in West Asia. Some of us have served and lived and worked in these countries for decades and more. I can assure him and all of you that to the extent that any Pakistan obsession existed, it existed in the previous century. I was ambassador in 2 countries, Yemen and Oman, which are of course not particularly special relationships with Pakistan, but I was also number 2 in Saudi Arabia, with which Saudi Arabia has a particularly close and special relationship. I did not hear from those foreign ministries, or did I on my own ever take the name Pakistan in my interactions there. The Pakistan factor is long dead. They don't talk about it, we don't talk about it. Now, to questions. Thank you very much for your patience. I'm very sorry that I could not ask anybody from the audience to ask questions, but Ambassador Ahmed, for example, keeps coming here and he'll be available to you. And all of us are always available on email. Thank you very much.
I request the chairperson for the track, Ambassador Ranjit Gupta, to kindly felicitate the speakers for this track. Dr. C. Raja Mohan. Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, Dr. N. Janardhan, and Ambassador Talmiz Ahmed. May I request Dr. Raman, our Dean of Management, to kindly come up and felicitate Ambassador Ranjit Gupta. Thank you, sir. We now have a short coffee break. The next session will begin at 3:45, so we request all of you all to be here on time because the keynote address is by Mr. Dharmendra Pradhan, Honorable Minister for Petroleum and Natural Gas, Government of India, and he wants to start the session exactly on time. Thank you.